Okay.
Okay. My name is Leslie Merklinger, and I'm currently the Director of Original Production for Food Network and Slice, both channels. They're specialty channels at Shaw Media. And I also work a little bit on HGTV, so it's a lot of lifestyle programming I do now. I started 30 years ago, so I've been in the business 30 years, amazingly. And I started as a producer. I was a producer for 25 years. So I'm on the broadcast side now, but I was really in the production side for most of my career. And I started at City TV on a show called The Showman File. And when we get around to talking about live TV, it's live to tape, and we can talk about what that means versus live or pre-taped, because there's all different kind of versions. But that was a really interesting first experience. And then just after that, I ended up working on Canada AM, went to CTV for several shows, worked and developed and created some entertainment shows. I worked on a show called Entertainment Now. And then I co-created E-Talk, which is still on the air now. I worked on, so I did a lot of entertainment interviews. I did news and current affairs. And then I also did I moved into some lifestyle shows, which were shows that run on HGTV and Slice. So that's kind of where I moved over to this side, so the broadcast side. And I worked for a ton of independent productions as well.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
So, can you tell us just a little bit about what you did on the shows, The Chat Room and Canada AM? Just
sure.
Walk us through an average day.
Yeah. Well, Canada AM is a good example. It's the national morning show that CTV does, and it's really interesting because when you just ask about walking through a day, the days kind of blend into each other, and I'll tell you why. The show starts at that time, I think we went on there at 6:30 a.m. live. I didn't go to the studio, but we produced the show actually just down the street from here in an office building. So we'd chase produce all day for the next day's show. And so what would happen is every morning there would be a team of about 10 chase producers, and I was one of them. And we'd sit around at 9 in the morning with newspapers and articles and everything that we sort of thought was relevant for that week, and pitch stories. And so we go around the table and pitch, I think we should do something we should update the NHL talks today. If I was doing it today, that'd be probably one of my top stories that I'd pitch. What's happening is Sidney Crosby a hero on the ice and in the boardroom, that kind of thing. So you kind of pitch what you think in all the areas that the show covers. So it covered politics and sports and entertainment and all kinds of things. So then our producer would say, okay, Anya, I love that story that you just pitched, so let's do that, and we'll go with your story on how donuts are really popular now, and we'll go with this story on Egypt and how they're the protests against the prime minister who's taken all this power. So it's a combination of kind of knowing everything about some international news, some local news, some provincial news, entertainment, sports, everything. We all kind of had our specialties, but that was how that sort of initial lineup started. And then there'd be a big board that our producer would write basically all the stories that he just greenlit. He gave me a yes, he gave you a yes, he had his lineup roughly on the show. So he'd write them on this board with erasable ink, which was very important because as we started chasing those stories, which means, and in those days we didn't have the computer, we didn't have the internet, so you get on the phone and try to find, and we try to find experts who could speak to any of those stories. So if it was the NHL story, for example, I would be on the phone to the Players Association or to a sports journalist or someone who I thought would be a great guest to talk about what I want to talk about. And so we try, and then sometimes the stories would fall apart. And it's like, there's really nothing new, it's not that great. So that would get erased off the board. And other stories would come up. It's like, something would come across the wire, a breaking story that we want to cover that next day on the show. So it changed a lot, in other words. That board was very changeable. And we'd interview the people that we'd found on the phone, and write up what was called greens. No idea. I think originally it was on green paper in some TV show long ago, but they're called greens, which are basically research packs. So they basically, was the background of the guest that we'd found. We had to organize all the logistics, like if they were in Vancouver, we had to book, which was what was called a double ender. They'd go to our studio in Vancouver, and our technical guys would hook up so that the interview would happen on a screen in our studio, but it would be a live interview, but done via a technological link that would be kind of bringing them in to have a normal conversation. Kind of like Skyping, actually. It's like Skyping. And so I would write up, you know, the background of this person I found, what their point of view was, what they brought to the table in terms of that topic, and then give some background, attach any articles, and then that would all go to my producer to be approved. And if all went well, it got approved. And then it would go to the hosts. We had 2 hosts. They always rotated over the years, but 2 hosts would be assigned one of the stories, one of the interviews. So I'd sit down with them usually around 4 or 5 o'clock at the end of the day, once we'd really settled on our story and prepared it, and I'd talk them through, like, you know, this guy's really interesting when you ask him about this. So I'd have a list of suggested questions. They'd ask me other questions. Do you know about this or that? I might have to do a little bit more research to give them everything they need in that package to do that interview. And the interviews were really short. Live TV is usually, you know, that kind of live TV, like any of the morning shows, are very quick. So it might be a 3 or 4 minute interview. And if you have taped inserts, you've got to get that prepared. You've got to work with your editor. And the funny thing in those days was that the entire show would get, like, whether it was my tape, maybe I had a minute montage that I put together, or a tape montage that needed to go with it, or other pieces, and all the interviews, everything I needed, plus all the other story editor or story chase producers would put their stories together, and the show would go in a cab up to the studio in Agincourt.
Oh my
Like
God.
literally a
Oh
cab.
my
And
God.
it was so weird. And so
Just putting a lot of trust.
totally,
in the
you
cab.
hope that, yeah, it was always the same cab driver. We used the same guy every day, or one of his guys, but it was a regular Beck taxi cab or something, but we knew the guy. And yeah, the whole show would go up to the studio to McCowan and the 401 near the Scarborough Town Centre. That's where we shot the show at CFTO. So then I didn't go to the studio in the morning because I worked that shift, but there were other producers whose job it was to take the show to air, which is when you think of, you know, any kind of a live newscast and there's a control room, and you have a producer, you have, excuse me, directors and technical people, but you have producers who basically run the show and they take it to air. So there'd be other people at Canada AM who did that part. So they would take my information and everything that all the other producers had put together and prep it and get the show to air. So if I screwed up, and if I didn't give them the right information, or if I didn't, you know, get the cab booked for the guy in Vancouver to get to our studio in Vancouver, or if I didn't get their information for their super correct, their title correct, that's all the information that I put in that cab was stuff that they relied upon to have a perfect show. So it was really stressful. And sometimes, I mean, I don't know about you, but, you know, if I interviewed you around now, you'd probably be pretty articulate and bright and smart. But in Vancouver, for example, when it would be 5 a.m. when they're on the air, they might not be so good. They might be a little sleepy, a little, oh yeah. And if you got them to say something really interesting on the phone, and maybe a little bit provocative, like, oh, Sidney Crosby's, you know, he's ruining the negotiations, and I'll say, are you prepared to say that on air? Yeah, he's terrible. But the next day they may have thought about it and they may not come through for you. So I would get up in the morning and put the show on like everybody else in Canada, but for me it was very different, right? Because I'm watching my work go to air live, and there's nothing I can do about it. Like, there were some times when I remember I had this great architect talking about, it was called sick building syndrome, which was this whole thing about office buildings not having good air and people were getting very sick, and there was this whole report about it. So I found this amazing guy who had all this great research, and he was really good on camera, because you can't just be boring.
Yeah.
You can't just be really smart and know what you're talking about as a guest, but you have to be really good.
Yeah.
And he was like, he could barely say his own name. He was so like, you know, sleepy and terrible, and I was just sick to my stomach. I was so stressed because I'd watch this go to air and there's nothing I could do about it. So you go to work and you're already behind the 8 ball. Like, I go to work and it's like, I don't want to look at my producer in the eye because he's gonna kill me. But those things happen on live TV. Like, that's a great example of live TV being really unpredictable. But then other times you get so much adrenaline booking something and getting it on the air and doing something live. There's nothing like it. And I find that TV people kind of fall into 2 categories: those who love live and those who hate it, because it's so stressful. I loved it. I thought it was exciting and exhilarating, and for all the horrible things that happened, just as many amazing things happened that you weren't expecting.